Hashtag the unlikely marriage. Caroline Evans was on the verge of getting married. Strangely enough, it wasn't to Eddy Morrison, the man she'd been head over heels in love with for 8 long years. Instead, she was about to tie the knot with a man she'd only known for a measly 5 minutes and knew next to nothing about. "You still have the option to back out," the man said cynically as they sat in the waiting room of City Hall. A pang of nervousness shot through Caroline. She nervously fidgeted with the already wrinkled hem of her shirt, and Eddy's cold, emotionless expression flashed through her mind like a bad dream. 3 days ago, Eddy, who usually avoided her like the plague, had called and invited her over for dinner. In her naivete, Caroline had thought that her 8 years of unwavering love and effort were finally about to pay off. She dolled herself up, looking her absolute best, and eagerly showed up at his place. But what she found there shattered her heart. Sitting in a wheelchair, with her fingers intertwined with Eddy's, was Layla Evans, her cousin. Layla looked radiant, as if she were glowing from within. Before Caroline could even process their relationship, Eddy dropped a bombshell on her. "If you donate your kidney to Layla, I'll marry you," he said coldly. Caroline was completely dumbfounded. She stared at him in utter disbelief. His gaze was so cold and indifferent, with a hint of hatred, that it was as if she were a sworn enemy rather than his fiancé of 8 years. Caroline felt numb all over. She and Eddy had been betrothed since they were young. When she returned to the country at 16, she'd fallen deeply in love with him. For 8 years, she'd dedicated herself to becoming the perfect wife. She'd learned to do the laundry, mastered the art of cooking, and even taken up music and art lessons. Despite knowing that he despised her, she'd been drawn to him like a moth to a flame. All she'd ever wanted was for him to see her worth and sincerely agree to marry her. But now, reality hit her like a speeding truck. Eddy not only didn't love her, but he'd fallen for her cousin. He was willing to sacrifice her to save the woman he loved. He knew how much she wanted to be his wife, yet he was only willing to fulfill her wish if she did the same for him. This was a blatant humiliation. All her love for him vanished in an instant and transformed into pure hatred. She was so angry that she wanted to kill them both. But she was also painfully aware that she was powerless to protect herself. Even now, Eddy's chilling words echoed in her ear. "I'm not negotiating with you. I'm informing you. If you refuse, I'll deny you the right to be Mrs. Morrison." Caroline clenched her fists tightly against the cold chair. Even though 3 days had passed, every time she thought about it, a wave of anger and disappointment surged in her chest. She knew that Eddy wasn't joking. As the heir of the most prominent family in Osprey, he had the power to make his threats a reality. If it weren't for Jude Morrison, his grandfather, Eddy might have just dragged her to the surgical ward without a second thought. So, to protect herself, she had to marry someone and stop Eddy's cruel plan from coming true. Caroline gulped and replied, her voice firm, "I won't back out." Then, she turned to look at the man sitting next to her. Kirk Morrison. He shared Eddy's last name, but that was where the similarity ended. She'd read his profile, and he was just an ordinary white-collar worker. The only connection he had to the Morrisons was that he worked in a company they owned. However, his ordinary background did nothing to diminish his good looks. He had an exquisite face, a tall and well-built figure, and broad shoulders. He was so perfectly sculpted that it was hard to find a single flaw. When Caroline first laid eyes on him, she'd thought he was the CEO of a well-established company. "Miss Evans," he said in a low voice. She'd been staring at him for too long, and a smirk played on his lips. He was so incredibly alluring that it was hard to catch her breath. Caroline snapped back to reality and awkwardly brushed a strand of her hair behind her ear, trying to cover her blushing face. Kirk watched her with amusement as she tried to hide her embarrassment. "Do you still remember our 3 rules?" he asked. "I do," Caroline replied. "The marriage will last 3 years. We can't let our private matters interfere with our marriage. And we can't fall in love with each other. If either of us finds true love within these 3 years, we'll end this marriage immediately." Kirk nodded in satisfaction. Caroline was confused. "Why are you suddenly bringing this up?" He relaxed his hands, rubbing his fingertips together, and lowered his head slightly. His eyelashes fluttered as he said, "I'm afraid you'll fall for me." Caroline was instantly speechless. She took a few deep breaths and then forced a bitter smile. Don't worry. I don't have any interest in men. She vowed to herself that she would never fall for anyone again. One broken heart was more than enough. Kirk raised an eyebrow, his gaze as deep as an abyss. After a moment he lifted his head. That's good then. Let's go. The sudden shift in the conversation left Caroline stunned for a moment. Then she realized that it was their turn to register their marriage. She got up and saw a couple of newlyweds leaving with their marriage certificates, beaming happily. Her vision blurred. She'd had so many dreams of going through this with Eddy. In fact, on the way to meet Kirk, she'd still been considering marrying Eddy. But then, she'd received a call from him. When are you going to the hospital? He'd said, sounding annoyed. When she heard that, Caroline felt a strange sense of irony. She wanted to laugh rather than be angry. Did Eddy really think she'd sacrifice everything just to marry him? All her hesitation and doubt vanished at once. She was even more determined to marry someone else. What's wrong? Kirk asked, pulling her out of her thoughts. She retracted her gaze and sighed deeply. Tears welled up in the corners of her eyes, but her expression was cold. Nothing. From that moment on, she and Eddy were nothing to each other. The thought brought her a strange sense of relief. Kirk could sense that she was carrying a lot of emotional baggage, but he didn't ask. He needed a wife, and Caroline had been recommended to him. Since they had the same needs, they'd come together quickly. And since they weren't overly concerned about their future, there was no need to pry into each other's past. Half an hour later, they received their marriage certificate. Seeing it, Caroline placed a hand over her kidney and sighed in relief. With this piece of paper, Eddy could no longer force her to give up her kidney. She was safe for now. But as soon as she thought of her parents, Caroline lowered her head. She hadn't had the chance to tell anyone about this marriage, especially her parents. Their greatest wish was for her to marry Eddy Morrison. The Evans family had once been one of the 4 most prominent families in Osprey, but had since fallen to a lower class status. They'd pinned all their hopes on her to marry Eddy and restore the family's former glory. If they found out that she'd married some nobody, they'd be furious. We should visit your parents next, Kirk said, shoving the certificate into his pocket. As he pulled his hand out, a gold watch under his white shirt was revealed. Even though it was a fake marriage, they had to do things the proper way. Caroline was shocked. Right now. Is there a problem? Kirk looked at her. Caroline's red lips parted. She didn't know how to explain without making him think too much.
No.
Let's go. She knew it was something that had to be done sooner or later. On the way there, she received a call from Eddy. When she saw the flashing screen, her expression froze. She remembered how she used to be the one calling Eddy, asking about his day. But he'd never once called her. Even if she were in the hospital undergoing surgery, she wouldn't have received an ounce of concern from him. But now, he was calling for Layla's sake. There was no way she could compare to Layla. Aren't you going to answer? Kirk asked, looking out of the window. He'd been resting his eyes, but it was obvious that he was annoyed. Caroline looked at his perfect face. Even though she couldn't see his expression clearly, she felt like he was irritated. She hesitated for a moment before finally picking up the call. Before she could even say a word, Eddy's angry voice came from the speaker. Caroline, get your ass to the hospital right now. Do you know how many specialists are waiting? Do you know how bad Layla feels? How can you be so selfish? I've already agreed to fucking marry you. What else do you want? Caroline smiled bitterly. Although she'd always known that Eddy didn't like her, she'd never realized how lowly he thought of her. If that was the case, don't you know what I want? Caroline's gaze grew cold. I want your love. Can you give it to me? You're fucking shameless, he mocked. I would never fall for a woman like you. Get here now, Caroline, and you might still be Mrs. Morrison. If you're late, you'll get nothing. Caroline looked up. She felt like her heart was breaking into a million pieces. I'm already married, she said, and then she hung up. It was the first time she'd ever done that, and it felt incredibly liberating. On the other end of the call, Eddy trembled with hatred. Then he sneered. Married? Caroline only wanted to marry him. How could she have married someone else? He thought she was just trying to scheme and fake a marriage to negotiate with him. How manipulative she was. After she hung up, the car fell into silence. Kirk, who'd been looking out of the window in annoyance, massaged his temples. The call had been so loud that he'd heard every word without even trying. And the man's voice sounded familiar. He was sure he'd heard it somewhere before. "It's no wonder you don't like men," he said, his charming voice filling the car. The sudden feeling of being understood made Caroline's tears flow like a river. She raised her head and tried to hold back her sobs. Gnashing her teeth, she said, "Men are all fucking dogs."
Kirk didn't argue.
He just glanced at her. She was trembling all over, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. She was absolutely outraged. But despite her anger, there was a determination in her crystal, clear eyes, as if she'd risen from the dead and was ready to break free from her chains. Something stirred in Kirk's heart. "I'll drive," he said. Caroline stopped sobbing. Kirk didn't dare to look into her eyes. "I don't want to die," he said. Caroline was at a loss for words. They swapped seats and drove straight to Caroline's home without saying a word. When they reached the entrance, Caroline finally managed to pull herself together. She looked at herself in the rear view mirror. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her lips were pale and bloodless. With her fair skin, she looked like a broken porcelain doll. She put on some eyeshadow and lipstick and checked herself before turning to Kirk. "I'm done." With the makeup on, Caroline looked like a completely different person. Her beautiful eyes were bright, full of calmness and gentleness. Her cherry red lips were seductive and alluring. "What's wrong? Is there a problem?" Caroline looked into the mirror again. Kirk looked away, a smirk on his face. "I didn't expect you to look this good." The way he said it made it sound different. Caroline didn't have the energy to argue with him. She anxiously looked at the villa, clutching her shirt. She took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and said, "Let's go." Kirk looked at the way she entered her own home, as if she were walking to her execution, and raised an eyebrow. Then he followed her in amusement. "Mom, Dad, I'm home." Caroline pushed the door open and looked into the living room. Dan Evans pushed up his glasses in surprise when he saw her and welcomed her. "Why are you back, Caroline?" After she came of age, she'd moved to the city to take better care of Eddy. When she saw the wrinkles on her father's face, her eyes watered. She realized that she'd spent all her time and energy on Eddy and hadn't noticed how old her parents had become. Thank goodness she'd realized who she should really be caring for in time. "Dad. And this is?" Dan immediately noticed Kirk, who was standing behind Caroline. With his sharp instincts, he knew that there was more to this man than met the eye. Caroline hesitated. "He's mine." "Carrie, you're back." A gleeful voice came from the second floor. A red-clad figure rushed toward Caroline. "Eddy called and said that you're going to get married. Is it true?" Caroline was stunned. "What?" Eddy had gone ahead with the marriage talk on his own. Dan didn't notice his daughter's reaction and excitedly asked his wife, "Is that true? Has Eddy finally agreed to marry Carrie?" They'd been waiting for this moment for over a decade. When she saw how happy her parents were, she bit her lip. How despicable Eddy was. He'd accurately guessed that she wouldn't go against her parents and was using them to coerce her. He'd do anything to achieve his goal. Just when Caroline felt like she was suffocating, Kirk placed his hand on her shoulder. His deep, charismatic voice came from above her head. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Evans. I'm Carrie's husband. It's nice to meet you." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. It felt like a life buoy had been thrown to her in the middle of the sea. She looked up and met Kirk's gaze. The amusement in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a deep emotion. For a second, even she believed it. She quickly looked at Dan and Sarah White, her mother. They were so shocked that they both collapsed onto the couch. After a moment, Dan was the first to react. He looked at Caroline and asked, "Carrie, what's going on?" Before she could answer, Kirk stepped in front of her, shielding her. The feeling of protection made her mind go blank. He said in his husky voice, "We just registered our marriage today. It was so sudden that we didn't have time to tell you." Dan was furious, but he tried to keep his composure. "Carrie," Caroline gritted her teeth and said, "What he's saying is true. I married him because I didn't want to marry." Before she could finish, Sarah rushed toward her and squeezed her shoulders. "What happened, Carrie? Didn't you always like Eddy? Now that he's finally agreeing to marry you, why are you?" Then, she looked at Kirk warily and said in a low voice, "Tell me, have you been forced?" Sensing that her mother had misunderstood Kirk, Caroline quickly said, "No one forced me. I just don't want to marry a man who doesn't love me." She was so exhausted that she didn't want to go on with this charade anymore. Sarah's fingernails dug into Caroline's flesh. "Do you know what you're saying, Carrie? From the moment you got engaged to Eddy, we raised you to be his wife. You're going to marry him to elevate our family, not for love." Caroline's shoulders hurt so badly that she sucked in a breath of air. "Mom." She looked at Dan. Dan looked at her in disappointment. "Carrie, divorce him immediately before Eddy finds out. You're Eddy's wife. How could you be so foolish?" He frowned as he said the last part. Any warmth he'd had toward Kirk was now gone. Caroline saw red. She didn't care if there was an outsider present. "Do you know why Eddy agreed to marry me?" Dan turned away. "I don't want to hear it. Divorce this man right now." Caroline was stunned. A wave of heartache washed over her. Looking at her father's back, she said pitifully, "He said that he would marry me if I donated my kidney to Layla." The room fell silent. Dan and Sarah exchanged conflicted looks. Kirk lazily lifted his gaze and looked at Caroline's parents. He frowned slightly. He felt an uncomfortable feeling in his chest, but he couldn't quite describe it. Caroline sniffed and continued, "You know how I've cared for him for 8 years. But he never loved me and got together with Layla while still engaged to me. Now he wants to use my kidney to save Layla. I can't even imagine what would happen if we married. If Layla wanted my life, Caroline couldn't go on. Layla was her uncle's daughter. She'd spent all her effort on Eddy and hadn't spent much time with her cousin. Although their bond wasn't very strong, she tirelessly helped in the search for a compatible donor when Layla's kidneys started to deteriorate half a year ago. But in the end, they were ungrateful and stabbed her in the back, demanding a kidney from her without any prior discussion. They wouldn't treat a stranger like this, let alone family. Sarah looked at her husband wordlessly, and they seemed to reach an agreement. Then, she gently tugged Caroline's hand. "Carrie, I know you're upset, but think about it. Donating a kidney won't affect you, and you'll be able to save Layla and become Eddy's wife. It's a win-win situation. What a great thing that would be." Caroline's expression turned cold. "What are you talking about, Mom? Eddy had betrayed her, and she wasn't going to make him and his mistress happy." She looked at Dan pleadingly, but he looked at the ceiling. "You're not a child anymore, Caroline. It's a fair trade. Don't be stubborn." Fair trade. Caroline trembled. She almost fell, but Kirk grabbed her wrist and pulled her up. She stood firmly on her feet and looked bitterly at her parents, who had doted on her since she was a child. If Eddy's betrayal had been a hard hit, her parents' words were like a sledgehammer. "So, in your eyes, my happiness is not as important as marrying Eddy and making the Evanses more successful." Fat tears rolled down her eyes. She couldn't hold back the frustration that had been building up inside her anymore. She turned and ran out of the house. She couldn't take it anymore. How could her loving parents not understand her? Dan and Sarah were about to run after her, but Kirk blocked them coldly. His face was devoid of any warmth. "The damage has been done. There's no use pretending now." His words hit the nail on the head. Dan yelled guiltily, "What right do you have to stop us? Caroline is our daughter." "So you remember that?" Kirk scoffed sarcastically. "I thought she was your maid based on how you talked to her." Then he stepped back and looked down at them. "She is my wife. I won't let anyone hurt her, not even her parents." His domineering aura stunned Dan for a few seconds before he snapped out of it. He yelled at Kirk, "Who the fuck are you to lecture us? You must divorce her at once, or I'll make your life in Osprey a living hell." But Kirk had already left the house. He completely ignored Dan's anger. Once outside, Kirk saw the woman slumped against the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. He stopped in his tracks. He needed a wife to avoid unwanted troubles, and he'd already achieved his goal. He didn't have to care about this kind of thing. He turned to leave, but the determination in Caroline's eyes, despite her bitter despair, flashed through his mind. He frowned in annoyance and started walking forward. But then, he stopped and looked back at her meek figure again. He turned around and strode toward the car, pulling the door open. He nudged her and said crossly, "Move over." Still lost in her sorrow, Caroline looked up numbly. Before she could react, a pair of hands circled her waist. In an instant, she was cradled in Kirk's arms. She was so shocked that she forgot to cry. Her beautiful eyes looked at Kirk in shock. What are you doing? They'd agreed it was a fake marriage. Kirk pushed her into the passenger seat with a stern face. He then got into the driver's seat and shut the door. Caroline was so startled that she jumped a little. Shigito glanced at Kirk's unpleasant expression, confused. She was the one who should be angry, but he seemed more enraged than she was. Kirk started the car and sped off. Caroline nearly flew out of her seat. She grabbed the handhold tightly, and her voice was distorted by the wind. What are you doing? It was as if Kirk hadn't heard her. He stepped on the gas, staring straight ahead like a wild beast in the night. The Audi A6 sped through the streets like a raging river. Caroline turned pale. She could barely hold on. The wind carried away her questions, and her voice was drowned out. Finally, Caroline stopped struggling and let the wind mess up her hair. Kirk was like a madman, driving her into the unknown. 3 days ago, she'd thought about dying. But suicide was too painful, and she couldn't bring herself to do it. Besides, she thought that even if her parents wanted her to be Mrs. Morrison, they'd understand her when they heard Eddy's crazy request. That's why she'd had the courage to let them meet Kirk. But in their eyes, the success of the Evans family was more important than her happiness. 20-something years of joy disappeared in an instant. The wind whipped against her face. She had no more tears left to cry. Her heart was dead. The car gradually slowed down. She looked out of the window, numb. They were at the seaside. There were only a few people on the beach during the sunset, looking like ants moving on the sand. The sky was filled with large, floating orange and red clouds. It was a peaceful scene. Caroline had lived in Osprey for many years, but had never known such a beautiful place existed. Aren't you going to look? Kirk asked lazily. Caroline looked at him. The anger had disappeared from his face, as if it had all been an illusion. He had one hand on the steering wheel and the other on the seat, staring out at the beach. He was relaxed but still had an air of superiority. His tousled hair made his perfect face even more attractive. Although she knew he was an ordinary person, her heart skipped a beat. She quickly looked down, avoiding his intense gaze. No, just looking at it from afar was enough. Kirk shifted his gaze to the woman's animated, yet dejected eyes. He remembered those determined but bitter eyes. His fingers brushed the steering wheel, and he looked at an eagle soaring high above. Haven't you thought about taking revenge? Caroline was confused. Your fiancé, Kirk said, feeling around his chest. Then he remembered his current situation and that he hadn't brought a cigar. His fingers went back to the steering wheel. He sounds like a jerk. Don't you want to get back at him? Caroline smiled, her gaze a bit hazy. Of course I have. But I don't have the ability to do it. Eddy was the heir of the Morrisons. He could crush her like an ant. Now that she thought about it, it was only because of Jude that she'd been allowed to be close to him. Once Jude stepped down, Eddy's hatred for her might lead him to do something terrible. I can help you with that, Kirk said casually. He looked at Caroline and then at the eagle, which had swooped down and caught a fish in its beak. After saying those words, he felt a sense of relief. Caroline smiled. Thanks for the offer. You're a nice guy. However, he's not an ordinary person. Amusement flashed in Kirk's eyes when he heard Caroline's praise. A nice guy? He'd been alive for almost 30 years, and no one had ever called him that. And just because of that, my offers have an expiration date. But as long as you say the word, I can help you get revenge. Caroline smiled, not bothering to explain further. Sure. But she couldn't help wondering what Kirk's face would look like if he knew that Eddy was the one he'd have to take revenge on. Just then, Kirk's phone rang. He took it out, and his expression changed when he saw the number. He opened the door and walked a short distance away before saying, "Speak." "Sir, the driver who caused the car crash has died. We couldn't get any useful information." Kirk's gaze was as sharp as a blade. He was a completely different person. "Only a few people know that I've returned. Keep an eye on them." "Yes, sir." His subordinate paused and then continued. "Old Mr. Morrison called. He wants to invite you to a party." "You..." Kirk looked at Caroline, who was staring blankly at the sky. "Arrange it." "Yes, sir." The subordinate understood immediately. Kirk hung up and walked back to Caroline. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I have some things to take care of. You can go. You don't have to worry about me. Caroline forced a bright smile. I'm fine. Kirk looked her over. Okay. And if you're not, don't blame me. Caroline was speechless. Why did he have to talk like that? After Kirk left in a cab, Caroline received a call from her friend, Gwen Jameson. Gwen was furious when the call connected. Carrie, that bastard Eddy is with Layla. I went to see my mother, and I already know, Caroline interrupted. She told Gwen everything that had happened in the past few days. After hearing it all, Gwen was so angry that she wanted to flip a table. Fuck this. They're so good at hiding things that we never saw their plan. You're not just going to let them get away with it, are you? What else can I do? Caroline was exasperated. I married someone so I wouldn't have to donate my kidney. How can someone like me take revenge on them? Wait a minute. What did you say? Married? Are you married now? Gwen started coughing and sputtering. After a few minutes, she roared. Who did you marry? Fuck, he's not Eddy's relative, is he? This is such sweet revenge. If Eddy finds out, he'll go crazy. Caroline was amused by Gwen's outburst. You've read too many romance novels. I just met him on the street. He has nothing to do with the Morrisons. The only thing they have in common is that he works in one of their companies. Oh. Gwen was disappointed. So, he's Eddy's employee. Doesn't that mean Eddy can bully you whenever he wants? Caroline's eyes darkened. He probably won't because of old Mr. Morrison. Besides, I'm already married. Eddy probably won't bother me anymore. Gwen relaxed a little, but when she thought about Eddy's harassment, she got angry on her friend's behalf. If it were me, I'd beat that man up. Does he not know how much you wanted to marry him? Caroline said, It's in the past, Gwen. In the future, Eddy and I will be separate. We won't interfere with each other. So your marriage? Gwen hesitated. It hasn't been told to old Mr. Morrison yet, has it? If he finds out, he'll be sad. Caroline had just started to calm down, but now she was worried again. She felt guilty when Jude was mentioned. He was the one who had arranged her engagement with Eddy. When the Evanses were in trouble, everyone had expected him to cancel the engagement and make her a laughingstock, but he hadn't. Instead, he'd publicly announced that she was the only one he'd accept as his granddaughter-in-law. Because of her, he and Eddy had argued several times. Now that things had ended this way, Caroline only felt guilty toward Jude. I'll tell him tonight, Caroline said. She'd rather he heard it from her than from someone else. Gwen was worried. Do you need me to go with you? No. Caroline smiled. He cares about me so much. He won't do anything to me. In the glittering halls of Starlust Hotel, Jude Morrison was sitting in the highest chair, a symbol of his power and status, and talking to Kirk Morrison. He chuckled. You're the one my brother trained. You're 10 years younger than Thomas, but you handle things so calmly. He can't do that. Thomas, Eddy's father, sat below Jude. He had a beer belly, but it was obvious that he'd once been a handsome man. What Dad means, Thomas said, unable to hide his admiration for his younger brother, Kirk, is that being able to drop everything you are doing overseas and come back home is an amazing thing that not many people can do. Kirk was pleasantly surprised by their praise. He elegantly brushed his finger against his lips. Thank you, Thomas and Uncle Jude. Our country is developing rapidly. I came back because I saw the business potential. Jude nodded slightly. Then he said sadly, It's a pity your father didn't come back with you. Otherwise, my brother and I could have reunited. Kirk's eyes turned cold. He said indifferently, It's a good thing he didn't. Otherwise, you might not have seen us. Jude frowned. What do you mean? We had a car accident at the airport. What? Jude said anxiously. Were you hurt? No. That's good. The old man sank into his chair and then asked worriedly, What happened? The cars crashed into each other. Both drivers died. Does that mean we can't find out if it was deliberate or an accident? Jude was sharp, witted, and caught on quickly. Kirk had been watching his expression. He was sure that the old man really didn't know anything before saying, Yes. That's why I need your help. Of course I'll help, he said. Your father and I are brothers. I would have investigated it even if you hadn't said anything. Thank you, Uncle Jude. But I don't want to trouble you. Kirk politely refused. I'll find out the truth. Not many people know that I've returned. I think I'll be able to find out soon. However, I'd like you to stop any news about my return. Jude said in a low voice. Are you suspecting that the other families are involved? He'd only told the other 3 large families in Osprey about Kirk's return. Kirk's slender fingers ran along the table. He didn't answer but said firmly, I just hope you can help me. Jude hesitated for a moment, raising an eyebrow. Then, he broke the serious atmosphere with a chuckle. Of course. He looked at Thomas and changed the topic. Where's Eddy? Why isn't he here? Thomas replied, he might be delayed because of work. Otherwise, he would have come quickly. He's been wanting to see Kirk. Yes. Jude said, smiling. Ever since meeting you a few times overseas, he's admired you. I've watched him grow up, but I've never seen him respect anyone else so much. Kirk put on a smile. His thoughts drifted to Caroline. Eddy? Wasn't her fiancé also called Eddy? Could it be such a coincidence? Kirk. Thomas waved a hand in front of him. Kirk pulled his gaze back and looked at Thomas. Thomas teased, What are you thinking about? You were really deep in thought. Kirk's expression froze. Daydreaming was a sin for him. But because of that woman, he'd committed it. My dad was asking if you're married. Kirk gathered his thoughts and sat up straight. Yes. Jude was interested. When did that happen? Your father called me before you came back and told me to find you a partner. How did you find one so fast? So that was what had happened. Kirk replied, I met her a few days ago. It was love at first sight, so we got married. But it was so sudden that I didn't have time to tell anyone. What a pity. Jude took out a photo. I even had someone in mind for you. I didn't think you'd find someone so quickly. If only Eddy were as decisive as you, I wouldn't be so worried. When he thought about Eddy and Caroline's marriage, Jude sighed. He couldn't understand why Eddy didn't like the knowledgeable and capable Caroline. Sir, the butler said, knocking before entering. He brought a phone to Jude. He said softly, It's Ms. Evans. Jude immediately smiled. He took the phone and said lovingly, How are you, Carrie? Why are you calling me suddenly? Oh, do you have something to tell me? All right, you can come here. I'm at Starlust Hotel. I'll send someone to get you. Half an hour later, Caroline was in the car that Jude had arranged and on her way to Starlust Hotel. It was only when she arrived that she learned from the butler that it was a party. Is Eddy here too? Caroline asked. She really didn't want to see him. The butler misunderstood. He smiled and said, Don't worry, Ms. Evans. He'll be here soon. Caroline was speechless. Would she be able to leave in time? Then, the door opened. Caroline looked over immediately, but her gaze turned cold. Eddy's smile froze on his face. He couldn't hide the hatred in his eyes. Why are you here? Caroline suppressed her hatred and said expressionlessly, To see Grandpa. Eddy sneered. She was here to tell on him, wasn't she? He hated women who told tales to his family the most. He ignored her and looked around the room. Where's Uncle? He went out to take a phone call. Jude looked at him and then at Caroline. Your uncle is already married. Isn't it time for you to get married too, Eddy? Caroline's heart skipped a beat. She grabbed the hem of her shirt. Grandpa. Eddy's voice was louder than hers. It's up to you, Grandpa. Caroline was stunned. Before, when Jude brought up marriage, Eddy had opposed it. Now, to get her kidney, he was trying to manipulate his grandfather. She tightened her fists under the table. But Jude and Thomas were smiling widely. This was Eddy's first time agreeing to the marriage. As if afraid that he would change his mind, they asked Caroline, What do you think, Carrie? Caroline took several deep breaths and suddenly calmed down. Since he was being ruthless, she wouldn't hold back either. She lowered her gaze and said shyly, I don't mind, Grandpa. Jude's laughter filled the room. That's great. I'll have someone arrange a date for you. Eddy glanced at Caroline, thinking that she was probably overjoyed. His disgust for her grew stronger. But then, Caroline said timidly, Grandpa, I have more to say. Everyone looked at her. She bit her lip, as if making a difficult decision. Since we've decided to marry, can I ask that Eddy keep his mistress under control? Then she added, I'm not angry. He can have as many girlfriends as he wants. I just don't want it to ruin our marriage so soon. Immediately, the whole room fell silent. Eddy's face turned red. He only had Layla, but Caroline had made it seem like he had a whole group of women. Jude hated infidelity the most. She'd done it on purpose. He lowered his gaze. Do you have any proof? He and Layla had been careful. They'd been together for 3 years without anyone noticing. Caroline blinked her eyes and choked out, I didn't believe it until I saw the videos. I didn't think you had so many women besides me, Eddy. Eddy sneered. She was really getting into it. Why don't you show us the evidence? Caroline pretended to cry. I deleted them after seeing them. They would only hurt me if I kept them. Then, she wiped away her tears and smiled. If we're happy together, I won't bring this up again. Eddy's face was as sour as a lemon. He'd been tricked. Caroline didn't have any videos, but she knew that Jude trusted her completely. Even without evidence, Jude would take her side. And, as expected, Jude angrily raised his cane and hit Eddy hard. You little brat. How could our family raise someone like you? Jude's cane was custom-made. It was silent when it hit, but even a light tap could cause a lot of pain. Eddy's back was quickly covered in blood. His face was as black as thunder, and he almost fell. Before, Caroline would have been upset to see this. But now, she thought Eddy deserved it. She looked up and happened to meet his gaze. The corners of Caroline's lips curled up slightly. She gently pulled on Jude's arm and said, Don't be angry, Grandpa. It's my fault. I shouldn't have said those things. He put down his cane with a huff. Look at you. Look at Carrie and how sensible she is. Go back and end all your shameful relationships, or I'll never forgive you. This was Eddy's first time being beaten, and it was by the woman he looked down on the most. He was furious, but he had to admit defeat. I was wrong, Grandpa. Everyone knew how much Jude doted on Caroline. Since Eddy hadn't taken over yet, he had to endure it. Jude calmed down. You have to be a good husband to Caroline in the future, understand? Eddy looked at the smile behind Caroline's eyes and clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles cracked. His heart was cold as ice. Just you wait, Caroline. Once we're married, I'll make your life a living hell, Eddy thought. Meanwhile, Caroline calmly smiled at Eddy's cold gaze. She'd been patient, but Eddy had pushed her too far. So, she was going to teach him a lesson in any way she could. If he wanted to force her to marry him, they'd see who could last longer. Seeing that things were getting tense, Thomas said, Eddy, your uncle isn't here yet. Go and see if he's lost. Eddy didn't want to stay there any longer anyway. He took the opportunity to leave. I'm going to find him, Grandpa. Jude waved him away. He was his grandson, after all. Seeing that he'd agreed to marry Caroline, he wouldn't argue with him for too long as he behaved from then on. Caroline stood up too. I'm going to the restroom, Grandpa. She needed to take a break. Eddy and Caroline both walked out of the hall. As soon as they were outside, Eddy grabbed her by the neck. Don't think you're untouchable just because my grandfather likes you. Caroline could hardly breathe, but the smile on her face remained. She choked out, Well, you should stop trying to use my kidney as a bargaining chip for marriage and tell Grandpa the truth soon. Otherwise, I can't guarantee what else I'll say. Eddy trembled violently. The Caroline in front of him seemed like a different person. She was no longer as obedient as a lamb. He tightened his grip and warned, Don't you dare play any games. I'll never cancel the marriage. You'll give your kidney to Layla. Then he turned and left. Caroline watched him go, suddenly unable to understand how she'd fallen in love with him 8 years ago. But she didn't dwell on it. She turned, about to ask an employee about what had happened to Eddy's uncle, when she saw Kirk not far away. She couldn't clearly see his expression in the dim light. His perfectly tailored suit showed off his perfect figure. His aura was powerful, like that of someone very important. Why are you here? Caroline frowned. Starlust Hotel was the most prestigious hotel in Osprey. Only the Morrisons could come here. Kirk didn't answer her question. Instead, he stared at her. Is Eddy your fiancé? He wasn't sure at first, but then Jude had called her Carrie. He started to wonder if such a coincidence was possible and had his assistant look into Caroline. That phone call was from his assistant. Once he found out that Caroline was Eddy's fiancé, Kirk began to be suspicious of his wife. Caroline wasn't surprised that Kirk knew about her fiancé. Everyone in Osprey did. She admitted, yes. What's the problem? Immediately, Kirk lifted her chin. She was forced to look up into his sharp gaze. It was like he was about to interrogate a criminal. Just then, he leaned in closer and the smell of mint filled the air and overwhelmed her senses. Her mind went blank, and she stammered, What's wrong?" Kirk didn't move. He just kept staring at her. Caroline froze, and her heart was pounding. She turned her face a little to avoid his handsome face and said weakly, "You scared me." Her voice was meek. Kirk's gaze darkened, and he tightened his grip, leaving a mark on Caroline's pale face. She gasped and met his gaze. "What's wrong with you?" Her eyes were as bright as the moon. Kirk got frustrated under her gaze and turned his head slightly. "Do you know who I am?" Caroline was confused. "Kirk Morrison." He narrowed his eyes, and his gaze became sharp. There was no sign of falsehood in her eyes. Either it was a coincidence, or she was a great actress. He let her go in annoyance. The tips of his fingers were still a little warm, but his gaze turned cold. "We'll divorce tomorrow." "Why?" It was so sudden. Kirk tugged at his tie and didn't look at her. "We'll meet at City Hall at 9 in the morning. Then, he walked past Caroline and left quickly. Caroline quickly followed him. "Are you worried that Eddy will come after you?" "Don't worry. He doesn't love me. He won't bother you. Eddy just wanted her kidney. He didn't care who she married." Kirk frowned and walked even faster. For a moment, he almost didn't want to divorce her. He must be crazy. Caroline was left behind. She watched him disappear and leaned dejectedly against the wall. Was it her fate to trade her kidney for marriage? In her agitated state, she didn't notice the butler approaching. She only came back to reality when he called out to her. Worried, he said, "Ms. Evans, is everything okay?" She was in a daze but answered, "Yes." "What's up?" "Mr. Morrison has arrived. Jude told me to tell you," the butler replied. At least she could meet that mysterious uncle. Caroline gathered her emotions and followed the butler back to the hotel. However, there was no uncle there. Even Eddy had disappeared. Jude explained, "They left because of an emergency. You would have seen him if you'd come a second earlier." Caroline was extremely disappointed, but to avoid worrying him, she had dinner with Jude. Caroline was exhausted when she left the hotel. She sat in her car and didn't want to move at all. Just then, Gwen called and said anxiously, "Babe, I have to work overtime tonight. Can you bring dinner to my mom?" Caroline didn't want Gwen to notice anything was wrong, so she said casually, "Sure." "Mwah. I love you, babe. I'll take you out for dinner once I get my bonus." They chatted for a while before hanging up. Then, Caroline told the driver to turn around and take her to the hospital. When she arrived, she bought some porridge and a few pastries and then went into the sick ward. As she was passing through the garden, she happened to run into Layla being pushed around by a nurse. In fact, upon closer look, there was a whole group of attendants taking care of her. One of them had a cup of coffee, and someone else was fanning her. Anyone would think she was a queen walking around the hospital. Caroline wanted to ignore them, but then she heard one of them say, "He's so good to you, Mrs. Morrison. He comes to see you every day and brings you jewelry. I'm so jealous. And he's so worried that one caretaker isn't enough, so he hired a dozen at once. He loves you so much." Layla spotted Caroline with her sharp eyes and deliberately spoke louder. "Eddy really loves me. If it were before, Caroline would have walked away. But today, she was in a bad mood. And the villain was right in front of her. She wasn't going to let it go." Caroline turned and walked towards the healthy-looking Layla. "What a coincidence, cousin." Then, without warning, she dumped the porridge on Layla's head. "I thought I saw a boulder moving around, but it seems it was just your thick-skinned self." The porridge was very hot. Immediately, Layla's agonized screams filled the garden. That's when everyone reacted. They frantically pushed Caroline over and wiped the porridge off Layla. But even so, her scalp was burning. Her tears fell in big drops. The nurse shouted, "Who are you? Do you know who you've angered?" Caroline replied coldly, "I'm Eddy's fiancé." Everyone was stunned. They started looking at Layla differently. Layla panicked and then started explaining anxiously, "Your engagement was just for show. There was no real relationship. What Eddy and I have is true love. Can you give him back to me?" Everyone looked at Caroline with disdain. Caroline scoffed. What a scheming cousin she had. She crossed her arms and said calmly, "Since your relationship is so pure, why hasn't Eddy called off our engagement in front of Grandpa?" Could he be lying to you? Layla's face twisted. There were a lot of people around, and she had to keep her composure. She bit her lip. I know you're upset because you have to donate your kidney to save me, Caroline. I know. I'll kill myself so you won't be upset anymore. Then, she wheeled herself towards a pillar and crashed into it. Before, Caroline would have backed down. But she was no longer the same person. She said casually, Okay, hit it again. Harder, okay? It's better if you die. Then everyone, including Grandpa, will know all the shameful things you and Eddy have done. Layla stopped. She couldn't keep crashing into the pillar, but she couldn't back down either. She hadn't expected Caroline, who used to care so much about Eddy, to say something like that. She tightened her fists, got out of the wheelchair, and started crawling towards Caroline. It's not what you think, Caroline. Eddy only put me in the hospital because he felt sorry for me. There's nothing going on between us. Honestly. Oh. Then, why were they calling you Mrs. Morrison? Caroline smiled insincerely. She didn't believe Layla's act. Layla's face turned pale. They misunderstood. They just saw how much Eddy cared about me, and thought that we were… Caroline got up and grabbed Layla's chin. Well, then you should remember to wait until your cousin is done before taking what's hers. Got it? Layla was stunned. The Caroline in front of her was confident and assertive. She was no longer putting Eddy first. Layla had never been threatened like this before. Caroline didn't care anymore and went to buy more porridge. After bringing Gwen's mother dinner and chatting with her for a while, Caroline went downstairs. The car from the Morrisons was still waiting for her. Caroline got in and said, Sorry for making you wait so long, sir. The driver was wearing a mask. He spoke in a low voice. It's okay, Miss Evans. She yawned and looked at the time. It was already 11 p.m. Just take me to Fergley. All right. The car started moving. Caroline yawned again. Her eyelids started to droop. This was strange. Why was she suddenly so tired? She usually only went to sleep at 2 or 3 in the morning. She rubbed her temples as she got more and more exhausted. Maybe she hadn't been resting well in the past few days. There was still a long way to go before she reached home, so she might as well take a nap. She relaxed. Soon, she passed out weakly on the car seat. The driver saw this and sighed in relief, then turned the car back towards the hospital. Meanwhile, on the top floor of Fergley, Kirk stood in front of the floor-length windows, looking at the city with a glass of wine in one hand and the other in his pocket. The city was full of potential, but his thoughts were on that woman. He drank his wine in frustration, unable to control his emotions. His good friend, Sean Yates, had been laughing since he came in. You married Eddy's fiancé. Oh, I'm going to die laughing. Kirk gave him a sharp look. Sean stopped laughing immediately and asked seriously, Do you really want to divorce her? What if your father finds out that you're not married and tells you to marry? While overseas, only one person had pressured him to marry. But now his big family was doing the same thing back home. Kirk had decided to marry because of that. He narrowed his eyes. Sean hadn't expected him to answer. He held up Caroline's photo and clicked his tongue. She's pretty. Can you really let her go? Kirk gulped down the wine. The sweet taste was bitter on his tongue. He said coldly, I don't like trouble. Sean didn't say anything else. Kirk had made his decision. Once he did, no one could change his mind. Just then, a ringtone broke the silence. Sean picked up the phone and listened to the person on the other end, surprised. You found a kidney donor already? All right, I'll go right away. Then he hung up and said, There's something I have to do at the hospital. I'm going there now. Kirk nodded casually. Sean walked a few steps and then said, You should think again about the divorce. I think Caroline is nice. Then he left. The office, which had briefly been filled with light, became dark again. Only the dark red liquid in the glass swirled mysteriously, like a snake trying to hypnotize its prey. In the hospital, Caroline's eyes opened slowly. She tried to sit up but realized her limbs were tied down. She had no way to move. Caroline looked around in panic and realized she was in a surgical ward. Her blood turned cold. Immediately, she thought of Eddy. He must have done something to the car to make her pass out. She struggled uselessly. Just when she was about to give up, the door opened, and Eddy walked in, wearing scrubs and a mask. When he saw Caroline, his gaze was as sharp as a surgical knife. After leaving the hotel, he'd gone to the jewelry shop to make a custom necklace for Layla. But when he got to the hospital, he saw her kneeling pitifully at the ward door. She was covered in porridge, and her knee was scraped. When he learned it was Caroline's doing, he was so angry that he almost destroyed the room. Once he calmed down and realized she was still in the hospital, he changed the driver and drugged the car. When Caroline passed out, he tied her to the operating table. He looked down at her arrogantly. "Feels good to be the bully, doesn't it? How does it feel now that you're the one being bullied?" Caroline didn't bother to explain. She shook the handcuffs and screamed, "Let me go, Eddy. Aren't you afraid of Grandpa finding out?" Eddy smiled cruelly. "Once he knows, we'll already be married. Then, I'll tell him that you used your kidney to force me into marriage, and I only married you because I felt sorry for Layla." Then, he turned to the doctor behind him and said, "It's up to you now, Dr. Yates." Sean was standing a distance away from the table and couldn't see what Caroline looked like. He nodded at Eddy's words. As the most skilled kidney specialist in the world, a surgery like this was easy for him. He'd only come back to do this surgery because of Kirk. "I'm leaving. The rest is up to you," Eddy said to Sean before turning to leave. At this moment, outside City Hall, Kirk got out of the car, attracting a lot of attention. He was wearing ordinary clothes, and his car wasn't anything special. But his presence made him stand out in the crowd. With his handsome features and perfect figure, it was hard not to notice him. Kirk stood alone at the door, facing everyone's attention. He looked at the watch on his wrist, showing off the smooth lines of his muscles. It was already 10 minutes past 9, but Caroline hadn't shown up. He didn't like people who were late. He called Caroline on his phone, but no one answered. This made him frown slightly. He was about to call again when a Rolls-Royce approached City Hall. Rolls-Royces were common in Osprey, but what was really noticeable was the license plate. It read, A0XXXXX. Only the Morrisons could have these license plates. He narrowed his eyes and watched as the car stopped at the entrance. Then, a few bodyguards opened the door, and Eddy stepped out in a white suit. When the people around saw him, they screamed, "Oh my God, it's Eddy Morrison! Oh no, he's at City Hall. Could he be marrying the Evans' daughter?" Eddy just smiled at their questions. With the help of his bodyguards, he walked towards City Hall. Then he saw Kirk in the crowd. He walked towards him, pleasantly surprised. UNC. Then he remembered Jude's warning to keep Kirk's identity a secret. He quickly said, "We meet again." Kirk nodded slightly and walked into City Hall with him. The crowd was left outside. Eddy finally walked next to Kirk and said in a low voice, "What are you doing here, Uncle?" Instead of answering, Kirk asked, "What are you doing here?" Eddy replied, "I'm registering my marriage." A chill went up Kirk's spine. "With whom?" Eddy answered, "With the girl that Grandpa arranged for me. I've mentioned her to you before. Didn't you hate her?" Kirk wasn't really interested in Eddy, but Eddy admired him. Eddy had talked about his marriage to him several times. According to Eddy, Caroline was a scheming woman, and he was determined not to marry her. That was before. Eddy didn't want to say more. He changed the topic. "So, what are you doing here, Uncle?" Kirk stared at him. "Where is she?" Eddy didn't understand. "Who?" Kirk moved closer and grabbed his collar. His gaze was cold. "I'll only ask you one more time. Where is she?" His powerful aura made Eddy struggle to breathe. He finally understood. His mind went blank, and he stuttered. "In the hospital. She's having a kidney donation operation." Kirk's pupils shrank, and the veins on his arms popped out. He gritted his teeth. "What did you say?" Eddy had kidnapped Caroline for the operation. Before Eddy could answer, Kirk pushed him away and walked towards the exit. But then, he turned back, his gaze as sharp as a predator's, and grabbed Eddy tightly. "If anything happens to her, you're dead." Then he turned and left. Eddy stared after him in a daze and took a long time to recover. What had happened to his uncle? He'd never met Caroline before. Why was Kirk so angry? It was as if he'd damaged something important to Kirk. Meanwhile, in the operation theater, Caroline's voice was hoarse. Her wrists were rubbed raw, but the door remained closed. Just when she was about to give up, the door opened, and a group of doctors came in. Caroline's eyes lit up with hope. Let me go. Don't struggle anymore, cousin," a silver, toned voice echoed in the hall. "You can't have surgery. when you're so agitated. Layla appeared in front of Caroline, with a nurse pushing her wheelchair. She looked at Caroline gleefully. Caroline clenched her fists. I will not give you my kidney, Layla. Layla said casually, did you really think I wouldn't do anything just because Grandpa likes you? Don't forget that Eddy is the one who will inherit everything. She dug her fingernails into Caroline's flesh. Caroline looked at her coldly. If I'm not wrong, we haven't been matched yet. Aren't you afraid that my kidney won't match yours? Layla laughed. She looked Caroline straight in the eyes and said, no. Caroline was shocked. She'd always thought that Eddy had brought up the kidney trade because they'd secretly matched her and Layla. That's why she'd tried to stall Layla with this. But now, she was uncovering a dirty secret. If we haven't been matched, why are you? Caroline stopped, a terrifying thought coming to her mind. She looked at Layla in horror. You never wanted my kidney. You just wanted me to die. If she died, the marriage would be invalid, and there would be nothing between Layla and Eddy. Layla laughed scornfully. You're not as stupid as I thought. Goosebumps appeared on Caroline's skin. She struggled even more. You're fucking crazy. They were willing to sacrifice a life just to be together. Layla laughed wildly. That's right. We're fucking crazy. I'm so jealous of you that I've gone crazy. Why were you the family princess? Why couldn't it be me? I'm also an Evans. Why do I have to let you have everything just because we were born a few years apart? Caroline looked at Layla's distorted face in disbelief. She'd never known how much Layla hated her. And it was all because of one marriage certificate. Just then, the door opened again. Sean, surrounded by several doctors, walked in. Start the operation. Get the anesthesia. Caroline was jolted back to reality. She screamed at Sean. I didn't agree to this. Let me go. Let me go. Sean frowned and looked at her. When he saw her pale face, he suddenly thought she looked familiar.